So she can fly, I guess. And obviously, people always joke about a swan can break a man's arm. Think about what something with a wing this big can do to you. Hi, I'm Matt Easton, a historical weapons expert and leader of Schola Gladiatoria, and I'm here with NME to look at and discuss the weapons, armor, and combat of Final Fantasy XVI. Let's get to it. Okay, so Clive's actually wearing what I'd term sort of medium levels of armor. It's more than light armor in that he's got arm armor. He's got mail or chainmail sleeves down for, I think, all of the arm as far as I can see, and pauldrons on the shoulders. He's also got what's called a gorget around the neck, very good for throat protection. And he's got some other random bits and pieces of plate and some leg protection as well. So Clive's standard sword here is essentially your common average longsword, just using this historical replica of the early 15th century. And you can see that it has a long grip, which we can grip with two hands like that. It has a crossguard, it has a pommel, and it has a tapering blade. Now, this type of tapering blade is really designed to deal with plate armor of the day, in that it's supposed to thrust. Very versatile swords and really, really popular amongst people who are going to fight in armor because it's more effective in armor, but you can still use it out of armor. We also see here that he's wearing a different type of armor. This armor looks more 15th century, but it's limited to his arms and legs. So he's not wearing armor really on his torso, except for his shoulders, but it looks like he is leaving off what we call the cuirass. So the cuirass covers the chest, the abdomen, and the groin and the top of the thighs. He's actually pretty well protected, but he's not wearing a full plate harness. The advantage of that is he's going to be more mobile, less fatigued, he can keep his armor on for longer, doesn't necessarily need to take it off all the time. So if you are traveling, adventuring, if you're ever by yourself, you need armor that you can put on by yourself. So having held a very good replica that's recently been made of the Invictus sword, it is massive. It's big in every part. It's got a big guard, very big base to the blade. It is heavy, and it strikes with an enormous amount of force. So if you're fighting giant creatures, this is the sort of thing that you want to be able to really wail on something. In terms of the ridge on the blade as well, the one thing that I found was it really benefited holding and half swording. So if you switch from holding the sword in the normal conventional fashion, let go with your left hand and grip halfway up the blade, it became a different type of weapon, a different type of beast. So I think with the combination of equipment that we've seen Clive has, he's got a preference for big two-handed swords, which tells us something about the way that he fights and possibly the type of opponents he's going to fight. But he does have another sword as well, and you know, he's actually kind of a jack of all trades for the armor, but his weapon, certainly the Invictus sword, is very specialised and seems to me like it's made with very specific objectives in mind.
It is you, isn't it, Clive?
Awesome, so Sid is armed with two swords as far as I can see there, and they both look like they're long swords to me, which means they've got long hilts, designed to be gripped by two hands, although they're not so massive that you couldn't also use them one-handed, for example, if you were riding something. He's dressed kind of in, we would say, kind of early to mid-16th century clothes, and the longswords really, really fit that, actually. We get these complex hilted longswords at this time. Carrying two swords is not very common. Usually you only carry one sword. Swords are not that easy or convenient to wear. They always bash things and get in the way. So this is a little bit like the Japanese daisho, as they call it, which is the big small. In terms of what he looks like someone, a duelist, a man about town of the middle of the 1500s, I would say. So perhaps the only bit of armor that he is wearing is actually down on his shins, and rather than being separate like armored greaves or something like that, they actually look like they're integral with the boots. And it looks like it's probably leather or something like that. So it's essentially enhanced boots rather than armor per se. So the type of clothes he's wearing and the swords that he's carrying, to me, very much imply sort of civilian self-defense. So this action where he draws the sword out immediately and cuts is something that's most famous from Japanese martial arts. It's known as Iai or Iaido. And this is the action of drawing and cutting in one smooth motion, which is obviously great in self-defense, because if you're suddenly attacked, you want to be able to get the sword out and deploy it immediately. What a lot of people don't realize as well is we actually have this in historical European martial arts as well. With the treatises, we can see that in the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries, people specialised in drawing the sword out in exactly the same way as they did in Japan. For example, there are scenarios where you're attacked by someone with a knife in the street. You're a knight or a gentleman, so you're allowed to wear a sword legally. And so you defend yourself with your sword, but you've got to get it out quick enough. You've got to block the incoming attack and then hit the person, kill the person who's trying to kill you, basically. But he's actually armed in quite a similar way to a Japanese samurai of the Muromachi or Edo period, for example. And so just to look at this, I've got a replica to katana here just to illustrate the point, and looking at Sid's swords, you can see some of the similarities. So as we can see, whereas Sid's sword has a distinct pommel and a crossguard like a typical European sword, the grip is heavily inspired by Japanese grips. The grip on a Japanese sword is called a suka, and this is called suka ito. That means the silk wrap that goes around, and you'll notice it leaves these little diamond-shaped holes. Underneath there is actually ray skin. It's like shark skin. But this is completely distinctive of Japanese swords. We find similar swords on some Korean and Chinese swords as well, but this is most famously from Japanese swords. And looking at the way that Sid wears his swords, it's easy to see that these are a fusion of medieval European swords and samurai-era Japanese swords, which I think is really, really cool because it makes them very distinct and different. So she can fly, I guess, and obviously if you've got wings and you can fly, this massively changes your weapon choices. So she's armed principally with what we call an arming sword. But it's not any old arming sword, so it's got a really elaborate hilt. So if we look at the crossguard, it's beautifully designed, but also plausibly and practically designed. It's got bits at the end which can be quite good for if an opponent's blade, if you're engaging with another sword, for example, comes down your blade, it stops them popping off the end. So a lot of sword designs have turn-ups or knobs on the end, like this does. Functionally, the most interesting part of her sword is that blade. So it has this lightning-like sort of jaggedness to it. Now this is not really something we find very much in historical blades. We sometimes find something that people often refer to as a flamberge or flame blade, which is wavy, but this is a little bit more angular. Now there's been a lot of debate over why you find these flame-bladed swords. You find them from various different countries at various different times. One of the things that people have noticed is it makes them very difficult for an opponent to grab. And so something that a lot of people don't know is that in a sword fight, you can grab a blade. So if you can control an opponent's weapon and thrust them, then sometimes it's worth a small sacrifice of a bit of a cut on your hand in order to stop yourself from being killed. So it seems to me that she's not really wearing any armor. It just looks like leather clothing to me. So if she's able to fly, I'm guessing she doesn't want to carry a lot of weight. And again, that would come back to the sword. This looks like a fairly light sword. The fact that we've got essentially a hollow crossguard, relatively small proportions and narrow blade. This is a light sword. She's wearing relatively light clothing, minimal armor. That makes sense for a flying person. Oh, so Dion is clearly ready for war, and there's a couple of main things that show that he's prepared for war. One is armor, okay, so we see more armor here. And he's equipped with a halberd, a type of pole weapon. That is, it's got a long shaft. Now, a lot of people think of swords as weapons of war, which they are, but swords are often secondary to a primary weapon. And the primary weapon in most medieval and classical world warfare is either a pole weapon, like a spear or a halberd or a pike, or a missile weapon like a bow or a crossbow or a firearm. And of course we have the armor. So the armor is a combination of mail, aka chain mail, which fastens up the front. It's long, so it protects the whole of the torso and down the outside of the thighs. Good, very simple solution to protecting upper and lower body at the same time. And then on the arms we see gauntlets, which protect the hands, which For anyone who's ever sparred with weapons, they will tell you how important gloves are, because fingers are just about the easiest thing to break, and that's with blunt weapons. With sharp weapons, fingers would be coming off. So having plate protection on when it's available in history, which it wasn't always, but from about the 13th century onwards, plate protection on the hands and arms, super important and very valuable in war. So what we're really looking here is medieval, late medieval knightly equipment. And people wore full plate armor, head to foot, helmeted all the way down to and plated all the way down to the ground. And very often it was very popular, particularly in England and France, it has to be said, to use the poleaxe. One of the reasons that it was more popular than bigger polearms like bills and halberds was because if you're fully armoured, it enables you to get closer into the opponent and overwhelm them at close range. So to me, I look at him and I immediately think officer, probably general, this kind of, a high-ranking officer, and maybe not dressed in the way that a typical soldier would be, dressed in armour for war, but of a higher social status. Okay, nice. So she's wearing a sort of corsetry, which is actually, it's interesting because we actually have these type of tight-fitting garments from the Renaissance, 16th, 17th century, and sometimes they can actually conceal protection. So even if it's just got what's called baleen, which is the sort of teeth-like things from a whale which we use for stiffening corsets, that actually provides quite a bit of protection. Generally speaking, people didn't wear armour in the streets in Renaissance Europe. But they did sometimes, and for example, the Medici were quite famous for wearing concealed armour underneath their clothes. So sometimes someone might look like they're just wearing normal clothes, but underneath they've got a mail shirt or what's called a brigandine or corazina, so they have essentially either plate or ring protection underneath. And that's what we see here. I think it's really cool, actually, that she has a split skirt, because one of the problems with skirts, I've been told, is they're terrible to fight in. They get tangled and everything, they're gonna get in the way of your legs and anything like swords that you're wearing or carrying. So the fact that it's divided like this actually functionally makes it a bit more like a kilt than a skirt. But for me, being a massive sword geek, the most interesting thing here is that sword. And I love the fact that she's got what we call a swept hilt rapier. Okay, and this is a fantasy take on a historical model of sword. So if this was a real historical sword, I would be dating this at about 1600 to 1630. And yeah, what a great sword. It's the ultimate duelist's sword. So he's really got his work cut out for him against this opponent. This is a tough, tough opponent to be fighting with. He is not only fully armoured, but he is also quick. He is good at grappling, does a leg sweep there, and he's got 2 weapons as well. So this is a super tough opponent. I love the fact that they're ending up on the floor, that they're grappling, they're wrestling. It looks like real fighting, and this is what real fighting always looks like. People always end up on the floor at some point. My advice to Clive would be, you've got to look for any openings in the armour, so particularly under the armpits, because that's always difficult to armour. Inside the elbows, people often forget about, okay, because you can't really armour there very well because you need the flexibility. Looking at the back of the legs, underneath into the crotch, not pretty, but it's a good place to stab an armoured person, and anything around the face. So grab the person's visor and pull it up because the visor will open. So look for those openings. But this guy's a really, really good grappler. So actually, I don't think you want to grapple for long because they look like they're really on top of their grappling skills. So these icons are absolutely massive, and when you consider something of that size flying around, the momentum, the energy it's going to hit you with, knock you to pieces just by colliding with you, but also nimbleness moving around is obviously going to be prime importance, because you can't just stand there and duke it out with something that's that big. It's just going to squish you. So moving around, looking for vulnerable spots, blind spots, a creature like that, trying to get under its wings, under its arms so it can't see where you are. Fighting very large creatures. In fact, obviously we know about hunting of very large creatures in past history, things like elephants and whales and stuff, and you have to go for vulnerable spots. St. George and the Dragon, for example, it's often shown in iconography with St. George's lance going through the dragon's mouth. And obviously the power of the sword, he's managed to completely sever one part of the creature's body, and finally goes in for that killing strike, the thrust into the eye. And doesn't matter how big a creature's skull is, the eye is always going to be a vulnerable spot. So from what I've seen, Final Fantasy XVI borrows heavily from Renaissance imagery and fashion and weapons, late medieval into the early Renaissance, but also some Japanese influences as well there that we can see in some of the ways that the weapons are worn and some of the details of the weapons as well. A whole bunch of different weapons like rapiers and big two-handed swords, daggers, and so on and so forth. And I think that armor is clearly an important part of that kind of environment for fighting other humans, humanoids, but also protecting you against creatures and potentially, you know, falling off giant creatures and things like that. But the fact that there are giant creatures there obviously plays such a big part in dictating the choices of armor and weapon as well. In a world with these creatures where you're contending with those, what weapons would you actually choose? So I think there's been some real imaginative choices made, and I like the unique takes on the weapons, some of the differences that we see in the arming sword, for example, with the sort of slightly serrated blade, and Invictus as well is a very iconic design of sword and looks really like no other sword that I've seen in the fantasy genre. I hope you've enjoyed watching the footage and analysing the weapons, combat and armour of Final Fantasy XVI as much as I have today. I have been Matt Easton of Scholar Gladiatoria, and you can go out right now and grab a copy of Final Fantasy XVI on PlayStation 5.
PlayStation